This video segment is going to cover the replacement of the inverter drive board in our Trilogy line of products. We want to remind you folks that we don't want you arbitrarily diagnosing and just replacing an inverter drive board. Please make sure you're working with the Trilogy technical support staff at Climate Master and get those instructions before you undertake this endeavor. One of the first and most critical parts of replacing the inverter drive board on the Trilogy line of products is power that unit off. Make sure that you power it off and wait every bit of 20 minutes. Don't speed that up. So we're going to go ahead and, before we start preparing the replacement drive board, we're going to go ahead and power this unit off. Now that we've powered this unit off, let me go over some of the components. First of all, there's a couple of different sizes of drive boards, and you want to make sure that you have the correct size for the unit that you're going to be working on. And when you get the drive board, it's going to come in a bubble wrap that is an anti-static, so please make sure you keep it on that anti-static bubble wrap. It's also going to come with a couple of thermal pads. These are thermal conductive pads. They're very critical how they get applied. We're going to cover that in a little bit. Some things about the inverter drive board is on the back we have our heatsink. We're going to go over the application of our thermal pad on that heatsink. This is a very critical component, and making sure you apply the correct procedures. The other thing is I want to point out on these boards is we have some notated locations in which you can handle these boards. It's handling. And yes, we've made a lot of jokes about it. It's an Asian person, but handling is where you want to hold this board. Make sure you're not grabbing a hold of it from the capacitors or any of the other inductors. Make sure you're holding it in those proper locations. So I want to discuss some of the tools we're going to need to use to properly remove and reinstall the inverter drive board. Good quality set of needle nose pliers and a magnetic tip Phillips screwdriver will make your life just an awful lot easier. One of the things you could do to make your time spent here a little bit easier is you may want to consider taking the EXM and MIM control door and taking it up off the hinges and gently just let it hang there from the bundled set of wires. It's firmly attached here. You're not going to have any issues there. That will open up a terrific amount of work room here for getting into this internal drive board. In this example, one of the things we're going to do, again, this is for videotape purposes only, we're going to go ahead and remove the lid to this downflow unit. We realize that in the field this is likely not going to be an option for you, but we're going to do this so you can see well in this videotape so that we can support the changing of this inverter drive board. Another suggestion you may find very helpful is most of us have pretty decent smartphones with cameras on them, and taking a snapshot of the wire locations and positions would probably be quite helpful before you get started. Again, as previously mentioned, what you want to make sure that you're doing is holding onto your board in the appropriate locations and grabbing hold of the terminal ends of your wire connections and removing them. Don't grab a hold of the wire and just pull, because you will probably separate the wire from that terminal strip. So again, supporting that drive board, make sure you're removing all of these connectors, grabbing a hold only on the terminal ends. Now we have our spade terminal ends disconnected. Now we're going to disconnect the Molex plugs on the back part of the board. You want to make sure that you reconnect these and make sure you have reconnected these prior to establishing power to the replacement board, because you could actually fry the new board by not having those in place. Next, we're going to take that Phillips magnetic screwdriver and we're going to come in here and we're going to remove the 4 screws that hold the heatsink onto our suction line cooler. These may or may not come out with the magnetic screwdriver. Again, we have a, in this case it did. We have that thermal pad in there. Sometimes they're retained by that. Let's go ahead and remove this one. That one seemed to stay in. Did that one. And then our final step, again, you need to make sure that you're supporting the board in the appropriate location. Although it's the old board, I'm not sure how much that matters. We're going to go ahead and depress our standoff retainer clips. There's 3 of them over here on this service access door side. Now we have the board fairly loose. I'm going to go ahead and support it top and bottom and kind of work it off of the stand-up clips on the other side. And now we have our board free and clear. Now this is an opportunity to kind of show you another little part of this. Some of our thermal conductive pad, as you can see, remained here on our copper suction line cooler. It's important that you don't take anything aggressive to that in getting that off, but you do need to clean it off. So see if you can get it pulled off very cleanly without damaging or compromising. If it's really difficult to remove, you may want to consider using perhaps isopropyl rubbing alcohol, but we don't want any other cleaning agents, solvents, sandpaper, anything of that nature. We want to make sure we have a good clean inverter board, or excuse me, suction line cooler before we attach our replacement board. So now it's time to go ahead and prepare our replacement board, and there's a few steps you need to be aware of. So you can see here the remains of the old board as well as the thermal pad. There's the missing pad we just took off of the suction line cooler. So here's our new board. Again, we're making sure we're not touching that much. We don't want to get oily skin on it. In your kit, as I previously mentioned, you're going to have 2 thermal pads. One is a backup. Guys, if you start to peel this off and apply it and you drop it or otherwise compromise that adhesiveness, just set it aside and pick up the second one. It's really important that you get good adhesion all across the surface of the heatsink as well as the suction line cooler. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply the thermal pad onto our heatsink on the new board. So you want to line it up and run your finger right down that center as you pull that backing off, leaving the top part in place, giving that protection on that thermal pad. We suggest that you work it from the center out, making sure you don't have any bubbles. Don't put a lot of pressure on it. Remember, it's resting on the anti-static bubble wrap and the capacitors. We really don't want to put a lot of pressure on that. Now, coming with this kit is going to be 4 replacement screws. So now we're going to go ahead and pull this protective film off. Again, guys, you want to be really careful not to touch that very much at all. Try and avoid that. If you do need to kind of roll it back down, make sure you're using that protective vellum to do it. And we're going to keep this handy. Now, what you want to do next, you want to take a small screwdriver and want to create the 4 mounting holes through the material, and keep those holes relatively small because we're going to use the thermal pad to try and help hold the screws into place. So I'm going to Again, making sure that I handle this board only in the appropriate locations. I'm going to take my magnetic tip screwdriver. And I'm going to try and mount these screws in there and let that protective thermal pad hold them in place for me. Now again, if I had too small of a hole there and I needed a little more support forcing it through there, I'm going to use my protective vellum to hold on to that thermal pad. So again, I'm not getting oily skin on there and compromising the sticky pad there.
Okay.
So now we're ready to install the replacement inverter drive board. So as we're bringing this board back into place, you want to make sure you don't lose those screws. Make sure they don't fall behind the inductor or anything. Make sure your wires are clear. But also, just kind of temporarily set it on our standoff supports, but don't press it home yet. You want to support that board on the bottom, because what you want to do is you want to line up and start in some of your screws on your suction line cooler. And I'm just kind of finger tightening these for the moment, making sure I have it on there square. I usually snug them up a little bit, doing opposite corners to make sure we're torquing it down fairly evenly. There is an actual torque specification in inch pounds. We expect that probably most technicians are not going to have one, probably not going to get one. So what you want to do, guys, is get them all four snug, put a little bit of pressure on there and just give it a little, like 1/8 inch of a turn. Make sure that each one of them is torqued down basically the same amount. That's pretty important. Notice that I'm not two-fisting Mondo torquing it and stripping out the screws, because that's not going to bode well if someone needs to come back behind you. All right, we've got those on there pretty securely. I'm going to check my standoff clips. Make sure those are on there pretty good. See one back here. And after checking all of my standoff clips, they're in secure position. It's time we can go ahead and start reconnecting up all of our plugs and wires, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Again, if you need to reference the photograph you took, please do that. Make sure you've got everything where it's supposed to be. Again, it's hard to not get it right because we made different kinds of plugs. And now we're ready to make our terminal connections. Again, those can be put on with a pair of needle nose pliers or hands if you wish. And away we go. Go through and make sure that we've got everything on firmly and correctly. Again, if you need to reference your picture that you took and or your wiring diagram. Looking good. Ready to put the swing out door back on and go ahead and power this unit up.